The termination letter is printed on Veridian Technologies letterhead, and Marcus Chen reads it standing in the parking garage of a building he has worked in for 9 years, holding a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a framed photograph of his daughter at age for sitting on a piece of heavy machinery at a job site, 3 engineering reference manuals he bought with his own money, and a stress ball shaped like a circuit board that a colleague gave him as a joke 7 years ago and that he has kept because the colleague left the company, and the joke, by now, feels like the only honest artifact of his time here. The letter uses the phrase performance trajectory inconsistent with organizational direction, 4 words that Marcus has spent the 40-minute drive from the executive suite to the parking garage turning over in his mind with the specific focused attention he applies to engineering problems, trying to find the load-bearing structure underneath the phrase, the actual meaning hidden inside the bureaucratic packaging. What he comes back to every time is this: for the past 3 years, he has been telling Veridian's leadership that their flagship thermal management system, the product that accounts for 62% of the company's revenue, the system that their largest clients, 3 semiconductor fabrication plants, and 2 data center operators, depend on to keep their most sensitive equipment within operational temperature tolerances, has a fundamental design limitation that will become a critical failure point within 18 to 24 months as client facilities scale their processing density toward the next generation of chip architecture. He has said this in meetings. He has said it in memos. He has said it in a formal technical review he requested, prepared, and presented to a room of 9 people, 7 of whom looked at their phones for significant portions of his presentation, and 2 of whom asked, when he finished, whether the timeline he was projecting could be moved to the following fiscal year. He said, "The timeline is based on thermodynamic physics. It does not respond to fiscal calendars." This is, he understands now, standing in the parking garage with a box and a letter, approximately the moment his performance trajectory became inconsistent with organizational direction. He puts the box in his trunk. He sits in the driver's seat. He does not start the car for 11 minutes. He is 41 years old, the son of a Taiwanese electrical engineer and a woman who taught high school physics for 30 years, and who told Marcus, when he was 8 years old and frustrated that the model bridge he was building kept failing at the same joint, that the failure is not the problem. The failure is the information. You have to learn to read what the failure is telling you. His bridge had failed at that joint because he'd been distributing the load incorrectly. The fix had taken 20 minutes once he understood the actual problem. He starts the car. He drives home. He feeds the cat, whose name is Fourier, after the mathematician whose work on heat transfer is foundational to the field Marcus has spent his entire career in. He makes coffee. He sits at his kitchen table with a legal pad and begins, with the specific methodical patience of someone who has just been given the most important piece of data his career has ever produced, to write down everything he knows about thermal management that Veridian doesn't. He writes for 6 hours. He had joined Veridian at 32, recruited from a graduate research program at Carnegie Mellon, where he had spent 4 years studying phase change heat transfer in dense electronic packaging, a narrow, technically demanding field that has, in the years since his research, become considerably less narrow as the semiconductor industry has pushed processor density toward limits that make thermal management not an engineering afterthought, but an existential constraint on what is physically possible. He had designed, in his first 4 years, 3 successive generations of Veridian's thermal management core, incremental improvements, each one extending the system's effective operating range and reliability. Then the semiconductor roadmap had shifted. Processing density had begun increasing faster than anyone's 5-year projections had anticipated. Marcus had understood this immediately because he'd been tracking the semiconductor roadmap literature obsessively, because tracking the literature was what his specific kind of intelligence naturally did, compulsively reading adjacent fields, connecting dots between research papers published in different disciplines, building a mental model of where physical constraints were going to force the industry's hand before the industry itself had fully processed the implications. What he had understood, specifically, was that Veridian's thermal management architecture had a ceiling. Not a soft ceiling, not a gradient of degrading performance, but a hard physical ceiling defined by the fluid dynamics of the coolant distribution manifold at the core of the system, beyond which the architecture did not merely underperform but failed completely and abruptly in a way that would not give operators meaningful warning before the temperature exceedance triggered automatic shutdown of the equipment the system was supposed to protect. He had done the calculations. He had done them again. He had had a colleague he trusted review them, a woman named Dr. Yuki Watanabe at MIT's Mechanical Engineering Department, who had looked at his work for 3 days and called him back to say, "You're right." And I want to be clear about what right means here. This isn't a degradation problem, it's a threshold problem. When client facilities hit the density inflection point, they're going to hit it fast. He had taken this to Veridian's leadership 3 times over 3 years, with increasing specificity and decreasing reception, until the termination letter, which told him, in 4 words of bureaucratic packaging, that he had been correct and that being correct had cost him his job. Marcus spends the first week after his termination doing something that surprises him. He sleeps, not out of depression, though there's depression, a low, steady hum of it that he has the self-awareness to recognize and the discipline not to catastrophize. Out of something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person who has been fighting an institutional battle for 3 years on top of their actual work, and whose body, released from the obligation of showing up to an office where every interaction carries the weight of documented disagreement, simply takes the recovery time it has been owed. His daughter, Lily, 12, calls him on the 3rd day. "Are you okay, Baba?" she asks. "I'm okay," he says. "I'm thinking about a problem." "What kind of problem?" He considers how to explain thermal management failure modes to a 12-year-old. You know how when you put too much stuff in a backpack, the zipper breaks? Yeah. I've been trying to tell someone that the zipper on their backpack was going to break. They didn't listen. Now I'm trying to design a different kind of backpack. A pause. Will it have a better zipper? Much better, Marcus says. Good, Lily says. The broken zipper is annoying. People lose their stuff. He sits with this for a moment after they hang up. People lose their stuff. That is exactly what will happen to Veridian's clients when the thermal ceiling hits. He opens his laptop. He begins designing the different kind of backpack. He does not look for a job. What he does instead is build a complete, formal engineering specification for a thermal management architecture that does not have Veridian ceiling, that approaches the coolant distribution problem from a fundamentally different direction, that he has been thinking about in the margins of his actual work for the past 2 years. The specification runs to 94 pages by the end of week 2. He has it reviewed by Dr. Watanabe, who reads it in 4 days and sends him 11 pages of notes, 8 of which are technical refinements and 3 of which, she writes at the end, are things I wish I'd thought of first. On the 18th day after his termination, his phone rings. Marcus Chen? My name is Sandro. I'm the VP of Engineering at Axiom Systems. I heard you left Veridian. I like to talk. He knows Axiom Systems. He has met Sandra once at a conference 3 years ago, briefly, in the way of 2 people who recognize each other as technically serious in a room full of people who are not. How did you hear? Your 2021 paper on phase change distribution manifold dynamics in high-density thermal environments, Sandra says. I've read it 4 times. It's the clearest statement I've seen of where the industry's thermal ceiling is and when, and what it would take to design past it. Marcus looks at the 94-page specification on his desk. "I'm available," he says, "for conversation." They meet in person 3 days later. Sandra Oh is 51, a material scientist by training who has spent 20 years in engineering leadership. With a specific quality of intelligence that makes technical people comfortable, she asks the right follow-up questions, which is rarer than it sounds. Marcus brings the specification. Sandra asks, within the first 20 minutes, whether he has done any preliminary work on the alternative architecture, and when he describes the general shape of it, she says, "Can I see it?" She reads it, not the executive summary, not the abstract, but the actual engineering specification, for 57 minutes. When she finishes, "This is what you were trying to build at Veridian. This is what I was trying to tell Veridian they needed to build," Marcus says. "There's a difference." "Yes," Sanders says. "There is." She is quiet for a moment. "What do you need to build it here?" "A team of 6, he says. 18 months of runway before we're in prototype. And a commitment from leadership that when the technical direction requires a difficult decision, the engineering lead's assessment carries actual weight." "The last one," she says, "is the hard one." "I know," Marcus says. "It's also the one I can't negotiate on." Another silence. "I've been running engineering teams for 20 years. I have fired exactly one engineer for being too insistent about a technical problem. I hired him back 6 months later when he turned out to be right. I don't make that mistake twice." "My 2021 paper," Marcus says. "Yes," Sanders says. "That's why we're having this conversation." The 3 engineers Marcus has in mind: Dr. Yuki Watanabe, who has become the leading academic authority on phase-change heat transfer in dense electronic systems; James Okafor, 29, who Marcus recruited to Veridian 4 years ago and who left 6 months after Marcus's final technical review, citing a cultural shift away from engineering-driven decision-making in his exit interview; and Priya Sharma, 34, still at Veridian, the most technically capable person in the thermal systems group, visibly frustrated in the way that competent people become frustrated when the organization stops valuing what they are most capable of. He calls James. James is quiet for a moment after Marcus describes the architecture. "This is the thing you were trying to build." "Yes," Marcus says. "And Veridian fired you instead of letting you build it." "I'll need 2 weeks to transition out of my current contract," James says. "Send me the spec." He calls Priya. "You know what I've been working on for the last 6 months at Veridian?" she says. "No, patches. Software patches to the thermal management firmware to extend the operating window by 4%. 4%, Marcus. We both know that's not going to be enough when the density inflection hits." "No," Marcus says. "It's not. Send me the spec." She has a decision in 3 days. She is leaving Veridian. 8 months into development, Dr. Yuki Watanabe calls him at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday with a specific timbre of excitement in her voice that he has learned to treat as significant regardless of the hour. "I need you to look at something." What she has found, running computational models of the new architecture's behavior under extreme conditions, is not a problem. It is the opposite of a problem. It is something that none of them anticipated, that the 94-page specification did not predict, that emerged from the specific interaction between the new manifold design and the phase change materials they selected after 3 months of testing. An interaction that, under the highest thermal load conditions they have been able to model, produces a performance outcome that is not merely better than Veridian's system or better than the industry standard, but better than the theoretical maximum that the field's leading models have been using as a benchmark for what is physically achievable in this architecture class. He runs the models himself. He runs them 3 times. He calls James, who runs them independently and arrives at the same result. He calls Priya, who checks the fluid dynamics analysis from a different direction and finds the same emergent behavior. Marcus understands immediately the discovery that changes everything. Not because it makes the product dramatically more impressive than planned, though it does, but because it means that the new architecture does not merely solve the ceiling problem he identified at Veridian. It solves the ceiling problem for the next generation of chip architecture after the one currently in development, and possibly the one after that. How is this possible? James asks, in the specific tone of an engineer who has just found something that their own expertise told them shouldn't exist. It's possible, Yuki says, because none of us assumed it was impossible. We were designing for a specific problem, not designing around what the textbook said was the limit. Marcus sits with this for a long moment. He thinks about his daughter's backpack metaphor. He thinks about his mother telling him, when he was 8 years old, that the failure is the information. He thinks about Veridian's conference room, 7 people with their phones, 2 people asking if the timeline could be moved to the following fiscal year. We need to file patents, he says. Tomorrow. Axiom's new thermal management system launches 18 months after Marcus joined, 1 month ahead of schedule. Within 6 weeks of launch, 2 of Veridian's 3 largest clients request comparative technical evaluations. Within 10 weeks, both have initiated procurement conversations with Axiom. Within 4 months, one has signed a contract to replace its Veridian systems across its primary fabrication facility. The second follows 6 weeks later. Marcus learns about the second contract on a Wednesday evening, while Lily is doing homework at his kitchen table. He reads the email from Sandra, contract signed, well done, and sets his phone down and goes back to helping Lily with a science assignment about heat transfer. Baba, does heat always move from hot to cold? Lily asks. Always, he says. That's not negotiable. Even in space, the universe has rules. Heat is one of the important ones. Lily considers this. What happens if you ignore them? Marcus thinks about a thermal ceiling, about a conference room, about a termination letter printed on letterhead. Then the universe enforces them, he says. Eventually, the density inflection point arrives for Veridian's remaining major client in month 19 after Marcus's departure, 2 months earlier than his original projection, which he attributed to semiconductor manufacturers' fabrication yield improving faster than the public roadmap indicated. He was right about the failure mode. He was wrong about the timeline by 2 months in a direction that made the failure arrive sooner. This is not publicly reported as a Veridian failure, because enterprise infrastructure failures of this kind are rarely reported publicly. The affected clients have their own incentives not to publicize the equipment disruptions they experience. What Marcus knows about it, he knows from 2 sources. Priya, who still has colleagues at Veridian, who described the specific internal emergency the engineering team is managing, and the fact that Veridian's remaining 2 major clients accelerate their evaluation of alternative systems in a way that is, given timing, not difficult to interpret. Axiom's sales team receives inbound inquiries from both clients within the same week. Marcus is, during this period, focused on the 3rd-generation thermal architecture that the unexpected performance discovery has made possible, working with a team that has now grown to 14 people in a building that still feels like it is growing into something rather than maintaining something. He realizes, happy, not in the performed way of someone who has won something and needs others to see the winning, but in the quieter way of someone who has built something that actually works in a way that it was supposed to work to the standards that the physics required, without anyone telling him that the physics needed to be more accommodating of the fiscal calendar. Sandra stops by his office one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee. Both remaining Veridian clients are in active procurement, she says. We'll close at least one within the quarter, possibly both. The technical evaluation went well. Marcus asks, The technical evaluation, Sandra says, consisted of their engineers reading our specification for 90 minutes and then asking whether we could start installation 6 months ahead of the proposed timeline. She hands him a coffee. They drink it in a comfortable silence, which is the specific kind of silence that exists between people who speak the same technical language and don't need to translate for each other, a silence Marcus has not experienced in a professional context in a very long time. 3 years after the termination letter, Marcus Chen is the Chief Technology Officer of Axiom Systems. He is asked once in an interview with an industry publication whether he considers Axiom's success a vindication. He thinks about the question carefully before answering. Vindication implies that the point was to be right, he says. The point was to build something that didn't fail at the critical moment. Semiconductor fabrication plants and data centers depend on thermal management to protect equipment that, in turn, protects the integrity of processes that people's actual lives depend on in ways most people don't think about. Getting that right was the point. Being right about why Veridian was going to get it wrong is just the mechanism by which the problem got in front of me. The interviewer asks if he has anything he'd like to say to Veridian's leadership. Marcus considers this for a longer moment than the interviewer expects. The failure is the information, he says finally. I hope they're reading it. Axiom Systems was acquired 2 years after Marcus became CTO by a major semiconductor manufacturer, an acquisition valued at $1.4 billion, the largest in the thermal management sector's history. Marcus Chen negotiated, as a condition of his personal participation in the acquisition agreement, the continued employment of every member of the original 6-person team. Dr. Yuki Watanabe leads the research division. James Okafor runs product development. Priya Sharma, whose fluid dynamics analysis identified the unexpected performance discovery in month 8 of development, was named chief engineer of the new thermal systems group. Veridian Technologies was acquired separately 9 months later in a transaction valued at considerably less by a private equity firm that subsequently divested its engineering assets. The thermal management specification Marcus Chen wrote on a legal pad in his kitchen on the night of his termination is currently in use, in its 7th revision, at 11 fabrication facilities across 4 countries. Fourier the cat is 11 years old. Lily Chen is 15 and has expressed a provisional interest in mechanical engineering, which her father has described as her decision entirely and her grandmother has described as inevitable.